April 9th, 1940. Under the cover of a pitch-black Arctic night and a blinding blizzard, Hitler's war machine executed the most daring, high-stakes, and complex joint military operation in the history of modern warfare, Operation Weserübung. In a single, coordinated hammer blow, the Third Reich shattered the illusion of Scandinavian neutrality, launching a lightning invasion that would forever alter the strategic landscape of the Second World War. Stalin's focus was in the east, Britain's eyes were on the Western Front, but Hitler looked to the north. The stakes were absolute. Whoever controlled the freezing waters of the North Sea controlled the vital industrialized iron ore lifelines that fed the German panzer divisions and secured an unbreachable naval fortress right at Great Britain's doorstep. Within a matter of mere hours, the ultimate asymmetric contrast of World War II would unfold across two completely different fronts. First, we traveled to the flat, open border of Denmark, where a small, completely overwhelmed nation faced a sudden, terrifying blitzkrieg that threatened to erase their sovereignty in less than a morning. And then we plunge into the freezing, jagged fjords of Norway, where a fiercely independent kingdom, confronted by a treasonous coup from within and an elite airborne invasion from above, resolved to reject absolute capitulation, fighting a brutal, desperate, and heroic campaign against the iron jaw of the Nazi superpower. Two nations, one master plan. This is the complete, untold history of the battle for Scandinavia. April 9th, 1940, 4 a.m. While the residents of Copenhagen were still fast asleep, the sky above the Danish capital suddenly filled with a low, rhythmic drone. Thousands of leaflets, printed in a crude mix of German and Danish, fluttered down like snow, covering the silent streets. Their message was simple: the Wehrmacht has arrived to protect you. But at the border, the reality was far from protective. German panzer columns were already smashing through the barriers, and elite paratroopers were dropping directly into the heart of the city. The Danish army, a force of cyclists and light infantry, found themselves facing the world's most advanced war machine. It was a battle against time, a battle for national honor, and a decision that would be reached before the morning coffee was even served. This is the story of the shortest war in history. 6 hours that changed the map of Europe. This is the invasion of Denmark. To understand why Denmark became a target, we have to look far beyond its peaceful borders. By the spring of 1940, the Second World War had entered a strange, stagnant phase known as the Phony War. While the great armies of France and Britain sat behind the Maginot Line, the real struggle for survival was being fought in the shadows of logistics and raw materials. Adolf Hitler's war machine was a hungry beast, and its primary diet was steel. High-grade iron ore was the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht, and almost half of Germany's supply came from the mines of neutral Sweden. During the warm summer months, this ore was shipped safely through the Baltic Sea. Nosio menyabase con precodo desimi. The Baltic froze over, forcing the shipments to take a long, treacherous route by rail to the ice-free Norwegian port of Narvik, and then down the rugged coastline of Norway to German territory. Winston Churchill, then the First Lord of the Admiralty, saw this vulnerability clearly. He called it the Iron Road. Churchill's plan was simple: mine the Norwegian waters and seize the ports. If the British Navy could cut this artery, Germany's ability to produce tanks, ships, and shells would collapse within months. Hitler knew he was in a race against time. He couldn't afford to wait for a British invasion of Scandinavia. He had to strike first. The operation was codenamed Weserübung, the Weser exercise. But as German planners looked at the map, they saw a massive logistical hurdle. Norway was a fortress of mountains and fjords, located hundreds of miles away from German airfields. To successfully invade Norway and hold it against the might of the British Royal Navy, Germany needed air superiority. This is where Denmark's fate was sealed. The flat fields of the Danish Jutland Peninsula were the perfect unsinkable aircraft carrier. Specifically, The airfields at Aalborg in the far north of Denmark were the only way for German Luftwaffe transport planes and Stuka dive bombers to reach Norway effectively. But there was another reason, one hidden in the dark corridors of the German General Staff. They feared that if they only attacked Norway, the British might use Denmark as a base for a counteroffensive, striking directly at the German heartland from the north. Denmark, with its 900-mile-long non-aggression pact signed just a year earlier, meant nothing to the strategic reality of 1940. It was a geographic necessity. On April 2nd, Hitler gave the final go-ahead. The Wehrmacht was given exactly 7 days to prepare a lightning strike against a neighbor that suspected nothing. The trap was set, and the gears of the blitzkrieg began to turn toward the Danish border. April 9th, 1940. As the clock struck 4:15 a.m., the peaceful silence along the Danish-German border was brutally shattered. Without a formal declaration of war, without warning, the massive gears of Operation Weserübung ground into motion. The German 170th Infantry Division, backed by the heavy armor of the 11th Motorized Brigade, breached the frontier posts along the entire length of the Jutland Peninsula. The Danish border guards, isolated and shocked, found themselves in a hopeless position. At the border town of Krusau, the first shots of the campaign echoed through the pre-dawn darkness. 3 Danish soldiers fell in the opening minutes of the clash, becoming the tragic first casualties of a war their nation didn't even know had begun. But as the German panzer columns pushed deeper into the flat terrain of Jutland, they discovered that the Danish army, though small and caught off guard, was not going to give up without a fight. Localized, fierce pockets of resistance began to spark in the morning fog. In towns like Lundtoft and Høkerup, Danish units hastily set up roadblocks, taking cover behind stone walls, ditches, and farmhouses. Their primary weapons against the German armored cars and light tanks were 20mm Madsen automatic cannons. These lightweight, rapid-fire guns proved surprisingly effective. Danish motorcycle squads and bicycle infantry scrambled to the front lines, pedaling furiously toward the terrifying roar of German armor. It was a surreal David versus Goliath struggle. In several sharp engagements, Danish gunners managed to disable German armored cars and hit leading tanks, briefly stalling the unstoppable Wehrmacht.
But Jutland was only one piece of a meticulously coordinated puzzle. While the ground war began in the south, the German Navy and Air Force were executing a series of daring, bloodless operations across the Danish islands. At the port of Getzer, the morning ferry arrived from Germany on its usual schedule. But as the bow doors opened, it wasn't civilian passengers who stepped onto the docks. It was a hidden battalion of German infantry. They marched off the ship and captured the town and its vital communications before the local police could even process what was happening. Simultaneously, the world witnessed a terrifying military first. German Junkers Ju-52 transport planes appeared over the skies of Masno Island. Within minutes, elite German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, descended from the sky, seizing the strategic bridge connecting Jutland to the island of Zealand. It was the first successful airborne operation in military history. But the ultimate blow was aimed directly at the heart of the nation. Under the cover of the morning mist, the German mine layer Hansestadt Danzig, escorted by an icebreaker, quietly slipped into the harbor of Copenhagen. The Danish coastal fortresses, confused by conflicting orders and unable to identify the ships in the fog, hesitated to open fire. By 5 a.m., hundreds of German troops were disembarking at the Langelinie Pier, just a short walk from the Royal Palace. The invasion was no longer at the borders. The enemy was inside the capital.
While the skirmishes in the fields of Jutland were turning into a desperate, bloody defense, the heart of the Danish nation, the Amalienborg Palace in Copenhagen, was waking up to a living nightmare. By 4:50 a.m., the King's Royal Guard noticed dark silhouettes moving through the morning mist near the harbor. These were not Danish troops. They were elite infantrymen from the German 198th Division, who had just stepped off the decks of the Hansestadt Danzig. As the German vanguard approached the palace gates, attempting a swift and silent takeover, the Danish Royal Guards did exactly what they were sworn to do. They raised their rifles and opened fire. A sharp, violent firefight erupted right in the historic palace square. The cracks of rifle shots and the sharp bursts of submachine guns echoed through the grand corridors of Amalienborg. Inside, King Christian X was already being briefed on the unfolding disaster at the southern border. Suddenly, the war wasn't hundreds of miles away. It was rattling his windows. One Danish guard was struck and badly wounded, then another. The sound of combat filled the air as the royal family took cover, realizing the enemy was literally on their doorstep. By 5:30 a.m., a frantic emergency meeting was convened inside the palace. The room was thick with cigar smoke, sweat, and palpable panic. Around the table sat the king, his prime minister Thorvald Stauning, foreign minister Peter Munch, and the commander-in-chief of the Danish military, General William Pryor. The news arriving by phone lines was catastrophic. The border was breached, ports were falling without a fight, and the communication network was being systematically severed by German commandos.
It was at this exact moment of chaos that the German ambassador, Cecil von Renthe-Fink, arrived at the palace, carrying a brutal and uncompromising ultimatum directly from Berlin. He informed the Danish government that Germany had not come as an enemy, but to protect Denmark from a British invasion. He demanded immediate capitulation. If Denmark refused, the Luftwaffe, which was already filling the skies directly above the capital, would commence the immediate carpet bombing of Copenhagen. General Pryor, a proud and fierce military man, was furious. He slammed his fist on the table, arguing passionately that Denmark must fight on. He wanted the king and the government to flee to the countryside or to the islands, to rally the army, and to defend the national honor at all costs, regardless of the odds. But King Christian X stood by the window, looking out over his city. He knew the harsh, pragmatic truth. Denmark's flat geography offered no natural defenses. The army was small, and a full military resistance would last hours, maybe a few days at most, before being completely obliterated. And the price for those few hours of pride would be the total destruction of Copenhagen, the death of thousands of innocent civilians, and the slaughter of his young soldiers. The air outside grew heavier as the low, rhythmic roar of German bombers grew louder, a terrifying psychological weapon hovering right above their heads. The clock was ticking towards 6 a.m. The king faced a choice that would define his legacy and the survival of his people. He looked at his ministers, raised his hand, and gave the most painful order of his life. He ordered the Danish military to cease fire. The battle for Denmark was over, before most of its citizens had even opened their eyes.
By 10 a.m., the firing had completely stopped. Just 6 hours after the first German boots stepped across the border, the invasion of Denmark was over. For the ordinary citizens of Copenhagen, waking up to go to work, the sight on the streets was surreal. German troops were patrolling the squares, and swastika flags were already being raised over strategic buildings. A nation had fallen in less time than it takes to complete a standard work shift. The cost of this lightning war was remarkably low in terms of human lives, but tragic nonetheless. The Danish military suffered 16 dead and 23 wounded. The Wehrmacht lost up to 20 soldiers killed, along with a handful of armored cars and aircraft destroyed by the defiant Danish border guards. King Christian X issued a radio broadcast to his people, urging them to maintain calm, avoid resistance, and cooperate with the occupying forces. Because the Danish government had technically accepted the German ultimatum under duress, Hitler granted the country a unique and bizarre status. Unlike Poland, which was brutally dismantled, or France, which would soon be divided, Denmark was treated as a model protectorate.
The Danish king remained on his throne, the parliament continued to function, and the Danish police and army were not disbanded. For the first few years of the war, life in Denmark looked shockingly normal on the surface. Hitler used the country as a propaganda tool to show the world how peaceful a German-led Europe could be. But beneath the surface, a quiet humiliation burned, and the seeds of a fierce underground resistance movement were already being planted. Strategically, Hitler had achieved everything he wanted in a single morning. By noon on April 9th, German transport planes were landing in a steady stream at the captured airfields of Aalborg in northern Jutland. They refueled, loaded fresh troops, and took off again, heading directly into the stormy skies over the North Sea. The stepping stone had been secured. The gateway to the north was wide open. Now the full, unchecked might of the German blitzkrieg was rushing towards its true and far more dangerous target. Norway was about to face the storm, and unlike Denmark, they would fight for over 2 months in some of the most brutal terrain on Earth. The race for the Arctic had begun.
April 8, 1940. Deep within the freezing, storm-battered waters of the North Sea, a lone British destroyer, the HMS Glowworm, was fighting both the mountainous waves and an invisible enemy. Separated from her main task force while searching for a man lost overboard, the destroyer suddenly emerged from the thick fog, only to find herself staring directly into the jaws of a Titan. Towering over the waves was the Admiral Hipper, a massive German heavy cruiser, flanked by a fleet of destroyers. The British captain, Gerard Roop, knew his small ship stood absolutely no chance in a conventional gun battle. The Admiral Hipper's massive 8-inch guns quickly began to tear the Glowworm apart, turning her deck into a screaming inferno of twisted steel. But instead of turning to flee, Captain Roop made a decision of pure, unalterated defiance. Riddled with shells, wrapped in thick black smoke, and with her steering gear failing, the shattered British destroyer turned, found her maximum speed, and charged straight at the German cruiser. With a deafening roar of tearing metal, the Glowworm rammed her reinforced prow directly into the starboard side of the Admiral Hipper, cutting open 40 meters of the German ship's armor plating before drifting away and sinking into the abyss. It was an act of bravery so profound that the German captain himself would later write a letter to the British Admiralty recommending Captain Roop for the Victoria Cross.
But this desperate duel in the middle of a brutal Arctic storm was not an isolated incident. It was the terrifying opening chord of a massive, secret, and incredibly complex military symphony. For months, the Allies and Nazi Germany had been locked in a silent, tense race to seize the strategic coastline of Northern Europe, a race where being late by even a single hour meant total strategic disaster. Unbeknownst to the British Royal Navy, the Admiral Hipper was not just patrolling, she was the vanguard of a massive armada. At that very moment, thousands of elite German troops, hidden deep within the bellies of disguised transport vessels and warships, were rushing toward the dark, narrow fjords of neutral Norway. The phony war was officially over. The battle for the Arctic had begun, and the fate of the entire European conflict was hanging in the balance. To understand the sheer scale of the tragedy that was about to unfold in the mountains and fjords of Scandinavia, we must first step inside the smoke-filled, secretive rooms of the German High Command in Berlin. By February 1940, Adolf Hitler had become completely obsessed with Norway. He was convinced that the British were preparing a massive operation to occupy the Norwegian coast, cut off Germany's access to Swedish iron ore, and turn the North Sea into a British lake. This fear was not unfounded, but Hitler decided that he would not wait to react. He would dictate the rules of the game. On February 20th, 1940, Hitler summoned General Nicholas von Falkenhorst, an experienced officer who had fought in Finland during the First World War, to a private meeting. The order given to him was unprecedented: design a complete, detailed plan for the total invasion of both Denmark and Norway, and do it in just a matter of hours. Falkenhorst left the Reich Chancellery, went straight to a local bookshop, and bought a tourist travel guide to Norway. He used that simple travel map to map out the initial movements of what would become one of the most complex, high-risk military operations in human history. The plan was codenamed Operation Weserübung, the Weser exercise. It required something that had never been done before in modern warfare: a simultaneous, combined assault by land, sea, and air forces against a country hundreds of miles away from German soil. The greatest obstacle for Germany was the British Royal Navy. The British fleet was overwhelmingly superior to the German Kriegsmarine. If the British discovered the invasion fleet while it was still out in the open sea, the German ships would be easily sent to the bottom of the ocean, along with tens of thousands of elite soldiers. Therefore, absolute, total secrecy was the only thing that could save the operation.
German planners went to extraordinary lengths to camouflage the troops. Heavy weapons and supplies were packed into ordinary cargo vessels disguised as civilian coal and grain ships. These ghost transports were sent out days in advance, moving quietly along the Norwegian coast, waiting for the signal to strike. Meanwhile, in London, the British government was locked in endless bureaucratic debates. Winston Churchill, serving as the First Lord of the Admiralty, had been screaming for months that the Allies needed to aggressively mine Norwegian waters to stop the German resource supply. But the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, hesitated, worried about violating Norway's official status of neutrality. It was not until early April that the British finally launched Operation Wilfred, a plan to lay naval minefields inside Norway's territorial waters, forcing German ships out into international currents where the Royal Navy could intercept them. British troops were even loaded onto transports in Scotland, prepared to land and occupy key Norwegian ports if the Germans reacted aggressively. But the British lines of intelligence completely failed to read the situation. They saw German naval movements in the Baltic, but they assumed it was a routine training exercise or a fleet designed to break out into the Atlantic Ocean. They did not realize that the entire German vanguard had already sailed. The Allies had designed a plan to lay mines and issue warnings, while the German forces were already approaching their targets with loaded weapons. The British were preparing a cautious chess move, while Hitler was already swinging a sledgehammer. The race for the Arctic was decided before a single shot was fired, and the Allies were late by a matter of fatal hours.
As the midnight hours of April 9, 1940 ticked away, a massive, silent armada was cutting through the pitch-black waters of the North Sea. This was the moment of supreme risk for the German Kriegsmarine. Practically every operational warship available to the German Navy had been committed to this single, audacious gamble. The commander of the operation split his naval forces into 6 distinct combat groups, known as Kriegsschiffgruppen. Their orders were absolute: strike 6 of Norway's most vital coastal cities simultaneously before the defenders could even realize that a state of war existed. The targets were spread across a massive hostile coastline spanning over 1,000 miles, stretching from the temperate waters near the Swedish border all the way up to the frozen, snow-swept landscapes inside the Arctic Circle. Group 1 was aimed directly at the strategic northern jewel of Narvik, led by 10 modern German destroyers packed with elite mountain troops. Group 2 was hunting the ancient port of Trondheim. Group 3 was heading for Bergen on the western coast, while Groups 4 and 5 were targeting Kristiansand, Stavanger, and the ultimate prize, the capital city of Oslo. To accomplish this monumental task, German warships had to sail right through a violent, blinding Arctic storm. On the way north, monstrous waves crashed over the bows of the vessels, washing equipment into the sea and causing severe seasickness among the thousands of infantrymen packed like sardines in the claustrophobic, pitching steel turbines below deck. Yet, despite the harsh weather, the German ships maintained strict radio silence, moving like ghosts through the darkness. They were operating right under the nose of the British Royal Navy, which was actively hunting them, but completely miscalculated the direction of the German advance.
For the nation of Norway, April 9th was supposed to be just another ordinary Tuesday. Norway had not fought a war in nearly a century and a half. Her people believed that their strict neutrality, combined with the dangerous rocky geography of their coast, would protect them from the madness consuming the rest of Europe. The Norwegian military was not mobilized. The coastal artillery batteries were manned only by a skeleton crew of young, inexperienced conscripts and aging reservists. As the first pale light of dawn began to break around 4 a.m., the thick sea fog hanging over the fjords was pierced by the dark, menacing shapes of warships approaching from the sea. They sailed with their lights completely extinguished, moving at high speed toward the harbors. In several locations, small Norwegian patrol boats, armed with only a single machine gun, bravely challenged the mysterious armadas, flashing warning signals into the fog. The response they received was swift, brutal, and explosive. The heavy guns of the German cruisers opened fire, vaporizing the small wooden patrol vessels in seconds. The illusion of peace was shattered. From the southern beaches of Kristiansand to the jagged, icy mountains of Narvik, the long, dormant fjords erupted with the thunder of naval artillery. The Norwegian people woke up to the terrifying sound of screaming air sirens and the heavy concussions of exploding shells. The Arctic blitzkrieg had arrived, and the neutral kingdom was forced into a fight for its very survival against the most ruthless military machine on Earth.
Of all the 6 German combat groups striking Norway that fateful morning, Group 5 had the most critical mission. Their target was the capital, Oslo. Their objective was to capture King Haakon VII, the royal family, and the entire Norwegian government before they could organize any form of national resistance. Leading this elite naval spearhead was the Blücher, a magnificent brand new heavy cruiser. She was the pride of the Kriegsmarine, packed with the latest naval technology, heavy armor, and hundreds of elite soldiers, Gestapo agents, and administrative specialists ready to take control of the city. To reach Oslo, the German fleet had to sail down the long, narrow waters of the Oslo Fjord. At its narrowest point, known as the Drøbak Sound, the channel was only 500 meters wide. Guarding this bottleneck was the fortress of Oscarsborg, an ancient coastal fortification built in the 19th century. The Germans knew about the fortress, but their intelligence assured them that the guns were obsolete, undermanned, and that the Norwegians would never dare to open fire on a modern German superpower. Commanding Oscarsborg that morning was Birger Eriksen, a veteran 64-year-old Norwegian colonel. He had spent his entire life preparing for a war he hoped would never come. Now, as the towering dark silhouette of the Blücher emerged from the morning fog at 4:21 a.m., moving silently without lights, Eriksen faced a terrifying dilemma. He had received no clear orders from Oslo. If he fired on an unknown fleet, he could accidentally spark a war or murder innocent sailors. But if he hesitated, the capital would fall. Standing in the command post, Eriksen famously turned to his men and said, "Either I will be decorated or I will be court-martialed. Fire." The fortress was armed with 3 massive 280mm guns, manufactured by Krupp in Germany nearly 50 years earlier. The guns were so old that the crew nicknamed them Moses, Aaron, and Joshua. Only 2 of them were operational, manned by young, terrified conscripts who had only been trained for a few weeks. The first shot from Moses was fired at point-blank range, just 500 meters. The massive shell tore through the air with a deafening roar and struck the Blücher directly in her command superstructure, instantly destroying her main anti-aircraft control station and killing dozens of officers. A second later, the gun Aaron fired, striking the cruiser near the aircraft hangar, igniting aviation fuel, and starting a catastrophic, unquenchable inferno on deck. The Blücher was burning, but her engines were still running, and she attempted to push past the fortress, firing her secondary guns wildly into the smoke. But Colonel Eriksen had one final hidden card to play. Concealed deep within the rocky cliffs of the island was a secret underwater torpedo battery built in 1901. The torpedoes were old, brass-propelled weapons made in Austria-Hungary before the First World War. The commander of the battery, an elderly officer who had been called out of retirement, carefully lined up the sights on the burning German giant. He pulled the lever. 2 torpedoes hissed into the cold water. Minutes later, 2 colossal explosions ripped through the hull of the Blücher, tearing open her engine rooms and flooding her compartments with freezing seawater. The proud heavy cruiser was mortally wounded. She rolled heavily onto her port side, her ammunition magazines exploding with a roar that shook the entire fjord. At 6:23 a.m., the Blücher capsized and slid beneath the freezing waters, taking hundreds of German sailors and elite troops down with her. The remaining German warships, horrified by the sudden destruction of their flagship, turned around and retreated down the fjord. The ancient guns of Oscarsborg had achieved the impossible. By sinking the Blücher, they delayed the capture of Oslo by several crucial hours. This window of time allowed King Haakon VII and his government to board a special train, escape the capital with the nation's gold reserves, and head north to rally the country. The battle for Norway's honor had been won by a handful of old men and obsolete German guns.
While the burning wreckage of the Blücher was still settling into the mud of the Oslo Fjord, the rest of the German invasion groups were systematically hammering the coastal defenses of southern and western Norway. The speed and coordination of the German onslaught were terrifying. This was the debut of a new, revolutionary type of warfare, a trimphibious operation, where ground forces, naval armada, and air power acted as a single lethal fist.
In the historic western port of Bergen, Combat Group 3, led by the light cruisers Kern and Königsberg, pushed relentlessly into the harbor. The Norwegian shore batteries at Covern opened fire, scoring several direct hits on the Königsberg and causing severe structural damage. But their defiance was short-lived. Luftwaffe Junkers Ju-88 bombers soon swarmed the skies over Bergen, relentlessly pounding the Norwegian artillery positions from above until the guns fell silent. By noon, German infantry was marching through the streets of Bergen, capturing the city's vital naval base. Further south, at Kristiansand, Combat Group 4 faced an equally stubborn defense. Hidden in the thick morning fog, the Norwegian fortress at Otteroya successfully repelled two separate attempts by German destroyers and the cruiser Karlsruhe to force their way into the harbor. The Norwegian gunners held their ground for over 3 hours, refusing to back down. But the Germans used a clever and ruthless deception. They spotted a French flag signal on a passing merchant vessel, and the German ships began transmitting confusing signals, leading the defenders to believe that Allied reinforcements had arrived. By the time the trick was discovered, German troops had landed and overwhelmed the perimeter. But the most revolutionary and tactically significant aspect of the southern campaign was unfolding not on the water, but in the skies. To secure total control of the air, Hitler needed to capture two massive modern airfields, Sola near Stavanger and Fornebu outside of Oslo. This mission was given to the Fallschirmjäger, the elite German paratroopers.
At Sola Airfield, a fleet of low-flying Junkers Je-52 transport planes suddenly darkened the horizon. Dozens of black dots detached from the aircraft, blossoming into parachutes just hundreds of feet above the ground. The Norwegian machine gun positions fought bravely, but they were quickly surrounded and neutralized by the aggressive, highly trained German paratroopers. Sola was captured in less than an hour, and within minutes, German refueling crews were already servicing Messerschmitt fighters and Stuka dive bombers, turning the base into a massive launch pad for airstrikes across the entire country. Meanwhile, the assault on Fornebu airfield near Oslo turned into a scene of absolute chaos. The initial wave of German paratroopers was delayed by thick fog, but the transport planes arrived anyway, running low on fuel. Under heavy fire from Norwegian anti-aircraft guns, the German pilots made a series of incredibly daring improvised landings directly onto the tarmac, crash landing their planes one after another. German infantrymen poured out of the side doors of the moving aircraft, firing submachine guns and charging the Norwegian defensive lines. The defense broke. With Fornebu secured, hundreds of German transport planes began landing in a non-stop stream, delivering thousands of fresh troops directly to the outskirts of the capital. By the afternoon of April 9th, German forces, under the command of General Erwin von Falkenhorst, marched triumphantly into the streets of Oslo. The capital had fallen not to a grand naval fleet, but to an airborne spearhead that had bypassed the coastal fortresses entirely. The south of Norway was fractured, isolated, and bleeding, while the royal family and government were forced further into the snowy wilderness of the interior, hunted by the Luftwaffe.
While the south of Norway was being overwhelmed by air and sea, the ultimate strategic prize of Operation Weserübung lay far to the north, deep inside the Arctic Circle. The isolated port of Narvik was the crown jewel of Hitler's ambitions, the gateway to the Swedish iron ore that fed the German war machine. To capture this vital freezing outpost, the Kriegsmarine executed a plan of breathtaking audacity. They bypassed the main British fleet by sailing directly through a blinding sub-zero Arctic blizzard that hid them from British radar and reconnaissance. Leading this northern spearhead, known as Combat Group 1, was Commodore Friedrich Bonte. He commanded 10 of Germany's most modern, powerful destroyers, packed to capacity with 2,000 highly trained mountain infantrymen from the elite 139th Mountain Regiment, led by General Edward Dietl. These soldiers, born and bred in the Alps, were specifically chosen for their ability to fight and survive in the brutal, snow-covered mountains of the far north. In the early freezing mist of April 9th, around 4 a.m., the 10 German destroyers slipped silently into the narrow waters of the Ofotfjord, leading directly to Narvik. But they did not find the port completely undefended. Guarding the entrance to the harbor were two aging stalwarts of the Royal Norwegian Navy, the Eidsvold and the Norge. Built in 1899, these coastal defense ironclads were completely obsolete, slow, and heavily outgunned by the modern German fleet. Yet their captains had absolute orders from the king: defend the territorial waters of Norway at all costs. As the leading German destroyer, the Wilhelm Heidkamp, approached the harbor through the swirling snow,
the Eidsvold fired a warning shot across her bow and signaled for the ship to identify itself. Commodore Bonte sent a German officer in a small launch to negotiate with the Norwegian captain, Odd Isaksen Willoch. The German officer demanded immediate surrender, claiming that the Wehrmacht had arrived to protect Norway from the British. Captain Willoch refused instantly, declaring that his orders were to fight. He shook hands with the German officer, turned to his crew, and commanded them to prepare the guns for battle.
But the Germans were prepared for treachery. As the German officer rowed back to his destroyer, he fired a red signal flare into the sky. Before the crew of the Eidsvold could even aim their weapons, the Wilhelm Heidkamp launched a salvo of 3 torpedoes at point-blank range. The explosions were catastrophic. The torpedoes struck the Eidsvold's ammunition magazine, instantly ripping the ship in two. In a blinding flash of fire and smoke, the proud ironclad sank into the freezing water in less than 15 seconds. Out of her crew of 108 men, only 8 survived. Hearing the distant roar of the explosion through the blizzard, the second Norwegian ship, the Norge, immediately opened fire with her 210mm guns, targeting the emerging shapes of the German destroyers. In the chaotic, close-quarters gun battle that followed in the blinding snow, the Norge managed to fire several shells before being struck by a wave of torpedoes from the German destroyer Baron von Arnim. The Norge capsized rapidly, her engines still running as she slid beneath the icy waves, taking another 102 Norwegian sailors down into the abyss. With the naval defense utterly annihilated in a matter of minutes, the German destroyers pulled up to the stone docks of Narvik. The mountain troops of General Edvard Dietl poured off the ships, their boots crunching on the snow-covered piers. The local Norwegian military commander of Narvik, a pro-Nazi sympathizer named Colonel Konrad Sundlo, surrendered the city without firing a single shot, allowing the German forces to occupy the vital rail lines and port facilities by the afternoon. Hitler had won the first round in the north. The strategic port of Narvik was firmly in German hands, and General Dietl's mountain-eager units quickly began digging into the rocky, frozen cliffs surrounding the fjord. But their victory celebration would be incredibly short-lived. They had successfully entered the trap, but the door was about to be violently slammed shut by the wrath of the British Royal Navy.
The German triumph at Narvik was spectacular, but it had created a deadly tactical vulnerability. The 10 German destroyers that had carried General Dietl's troops into the frozen north were now trapped inside the narrow, jagged fjords. They had exhausted most of their fuel during the high-speed dash through the Arctic storm, and the secret German tanker ship that was supposed to refuel them had been intercepted and sunk by the Norwegians. Only one single refueling vessel, the Jan Wellem, had managed to reach Narvik. Refueling 10 massive modern warships from one small single tanker was a painfully slow process. The German ships were sitting ducks, and time was running out. The British Royal Navy, recovering from the initial shock of the surprise invasion, reacted with absolute fury. On the early, freezing morning of April 10th, just 24 hours after the German occupation of the town, the British 2nd Destroyer Flotilla slipped undetected into the Ofot Fjord. Commanded by Captain Bernard Wartenberg Lee, the flotilla consisted of 5 H-class destroyers: Hardy, Hotspur, Havoc, Hunter, and Hostel. Guided by the thick, swirling snow and the morning mist, the British warships achieved total tactical surprise. They burst into Narvik Harbor at 4:30 a.m., their guns blazing and torpedoes hissing into the water. The harbor instantly turned into a chaotic arena of fire and exploding steel. The first British torpedo struck the German flagship, the Wilhelm Heidkamp, blowing off her entire stern. Commodore Friedrich Bonte, the German naval commander, was killed instantly in the blast along with most of his staff. Another German destroyer, the Anton Schmidt, was torn apart by 2 torpedoes, fracturing her hull and sending her rapidly to the bottom. As the British ships turned to exit the fjord, believing they had completed their mission, they were suddenly ambushed by the remaining German destroyers emerging from neighboring side fjords. A brutal, close-range gun battle erupted amidst the ice and snow. The British flagship, HMS Hardy, was heavily battered, her bridge shattered, and Captain Wartenberg Lee was mortally wounded. The HMS Hunter was sunk, and the Hotspur suffered severe damage. Both sides withdrew, bleeding heavily. For his supreme bravery during the raid, Captain Wartenberg Lee was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the first of the Second World War. But this first engagement was merely a prelude to total annihilation. 3 days later, on April 13th, the British returned to finish the job. This time, they didn't just send light destroyers. Emerging from the Arctic mist was the towering, legendary silhouette of the HMS Warspite, a massive, heavily armored British dreadnought battleship, accompanied by a heavy escort of 9 destroyers. The appearance of a British battleship inside the narrow, enclosed waters of a fjord was a terrifying sight for the remaining German captains. The Warspite's massive 15-inch guns began to roar, their thunderous concussions echoing off the towering mountain walls. The German destroyers fought back with desperate ferocity, firing their remaining torpedoes and shells, but they were hopelessly outgunned. The heavy British shells tore through the thin, unarmored hulls of the German ships like paper.
One by one, the German destroyers were hunted down and systematically destroyed. The Erich Kölner was battered to pieces by the Warspite's main artillery. The Dieter von Rover was blown up at her berth. The remaining German ships, completely out of ammunition and cornered at the dead end of the Rombax Fjord, were deliberately run aground or scuttled by their own crews to prevent capture. By the late afternoon of April 13th, the waters of Narvik were silent again, covered in a thick layer of black oil, burning wreckage, and floating debris. All 10 of Germany's most modern destroyers had been completely wiped off the naval charts. It was a catastrophic, devastating blow to the Kriegsmarine, losing half of their modern destroyer fleet in a single week. General Eduard Dietl and his 2,000 surviving Alpine troops were now completely cut off from the sea, isolated in the freezing mountains with no hope of naval reinforcement or supply, waiting for the combined Allied forces to land and crush them.
The total destruction of the German destroyer fleet at Narvik completely altered the strategic landscape of the campaign. For the first time since the outbreak of the war, Nazi Germany looked vulnerable. General Eduard Dietl and his surviving mountain troops, now joined by hundreds of stranded German sailors who had escaped their sinking destroyers, were entirely cut off from the outside world. They were cornered against the Swedish border, short on food, low on ammunition, and forced to face the freezing sub-zero temperatures of the Arctic Spring. The Western Allies saw a golden opportunity to inflict a crushing strategic defeat on Hitler. An international expeditionary force was hastily assembled and rushed to the northern shores of Norway. This was a truly global coalition: elite British guardsmen, fierce French Foreign Legionnaires, specialized French Alpine chasseurs, and the brave Polish Independent Highland Brigade, composed of men who were desperate to avenge the conquest of their homeland. By mid-April, Allied troops began disembarking at Harstad, a small town north of Narvik. But from the very beginning, the Allied counteroffensive was plagued by severe logistical failures and a complete lack of coordination. British troops arrived in the Arctic wilderness wearing standard wool uniforms, entirely unequipped for the deep snow and freezing blizzards. Their heavy weapons and radios were packed on separate ships, many of which were delayed or lost. Furthermore, the Allied generals, terrified of the devastating precision of the German Luftwaffe, hesitated to launch a direct aggressive assault on Narvik itself, wasting weeks in cautious, slow maneuvers. Despite the chaos, when the actual fighting began in the jagged vertical mountains surrounding the Ofot Fjord, it was brutal, primitive, and relentless. The French Alpine troops and the Polish Highland Brigade proved to be exceptional warriors in the snow. They fought a grueling war of attrition, scaling icy cliffs, wading through waist-deep snowdrifts, and systematically clearing out German machine gun nests and sniper positions on the mountain peaks.
General Dietl's forces were pushed to the absolute limit. They were forced to scavenge for supplies, using weapons stripped from fallen Norwegian soldiers and collecting food dropped by lone Luftwaffe transport planes that occasionally braved the British air defenses. By the end of May, the pressure from the Allies became unbearable. On May 28th, a combined French, Polish, and Norwegian assault finally succeeded in driving the Germans out of Narvik. General Dietl's battered forces retreated into the mountains toward the Swedish border, on the verge of total collapse. It was the first major land victory for the Allies in the Second World War. But the celebration in the streets of Narvik lasted less than 48 hours. While the Allies were winning the battle in the Arctic, the entire global geopolitical situation was collapsing thousands of miles to the south. On May 10, 1940, Hitler had launched his massive, long-awaited blitzkrieg against France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The German panzers had smashed through the Ardennes forest, bypassed the Maginot Line, and trapped the British Expeditionary Force on the beaches of Dunkirk. France was bleeding to death, and Great Britain was facing the terrifying prospect of an immediate German invasion of its own home islands. The strategic priorities shifted in an instant. Norway no longer mattered.
London and Paris issued a secret, devastating order to their commanders in the north: abandon Narvik, halt the offensive, and evacuate all troops immediately. The Allied soldiers, who had bled for weeks to capture the city, were stunned. Between June 4th and June 8th, under the cover of strict secrecy and a naval smokescreen, over 24,000 Allied troops were loaded onto transport ships and evacuated from Norway. The Norwegian army, left completely alone and betrayed by their allies, had no choice but to lay down their arms. On June 10, 1940, the Norwegian military officially capitulated. General Dietl's mountain troops marched back down from the cliffs into the abandoned, smoking ruins of Narvik. A campaign that had come so close to an Allied victory ended in a bitter, tragic defeat.
The battle for Norway was finally over. For 62 days, the Norwegian people and their allies had waged a fierce, desperate struggle against the terrifying mechanics of the German blitzkrieg. It was the longest and most fluid campaign of the war so far, outside of the conquest of Poland. But its conclusion left Scandinavia completely locked in the iron grip of the Third Reich. The strategic consequences for Adolf Hitler were immense. By conquering Norway, Germany had secured its critical northern flank, transforming the Norwegian fjords into a massive, impenetrable shield of naval bases, submarine pens, and long-range radar stations. For the rest of the war, the vital Swedish iron ore flowed uninterrupted into the roaring furnaces of the German Ruhr Valley, entirely unbothered by British blockade attempts. Furthermore, these newly acquired Arctic bases would later become a launching pad for deadly attacks against the famous Allied Arctic supply convoys to Soviet Russia, costing the Allies thousands of lives and millions of tons of crucial wartime supplies. But the price Hitler paid for this frozen victory was high, and it would leave a scar on his war machine that never truly healed. The Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, was effectively crippled. In the fjords and waters of Norway, Germany had lost 1 heavy cruiser, 2 light cruisers, 10 modern destroyers, and numerous submarines and transport ships. Nearly half of its operational surface fleet was sitting at the bottom of the ocean. When Hitler later faced the prospect of invading Great Britain during the Battle of Britain, he simply did not have the warships left to protect a cross-channel landing.
Politically, the Norwegian disaster triggered a massive earthquake in London. The spectacular failure of the Allied Expeditionary Force caused a wave of fury inside the British Parliament, leading directly to the political collapse and resignation of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. In his place, on May 10, 1940, a new leader stepped into the light to guide the British Empire through its darkest hour: Winston Churchill. The man who had pushed hardest to secure Norway was now the master of Great Britain's destiny. Norway's long night of occupation had begun, a night that would last for 5 brutal years. King Haakon VII and his government arrived safely in London, establishing a government in exile that would coordinate a fierce, shadowy underground resistance movement back home, demonstrating to the world that while their land was occupied, their spirit was never broken. Every single week, we bring you new, in-depth breakdowns of the most critical events, hidden strategies, and untold stories of the war. To make sure you never miss an episode, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the notification bell. Your support is what keeps this project alive. If you found this story compelling, please leave a like, and don't forget to drop your thoughts in the comments section below. We read and reply to every single one. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned, and we will see you in the next video.